All right. Okay, so I'd like to start by thanking Dr. Osteen and the Center for the Humanities for giving me this forum to present my research, and Dr. Mangiavellano for being a very encouraging, knowledgeable, and inspiring mentor. All right, so my presentation is titled A Humble Imitation, Literary Appropriations of Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale in Coleridge's Zapolya, which is very exciting and not dense at all. Samuel Taylor Coleridge is a really fun figure in the history of English literature, and to give you an idea of who he is and what he's all about, I've constructed a short profile. So, you can see here that he is a famous romantic poet, a former Royal Dragoon soldier. He was a well-respected public lecturer on Shakespeare, and most importantly, an opium connoisseur. Coleridge had immense trouble completing most of his works and curiously lived with his doctor in his final years after divorcing his wife and moving to London. And now you're all thinking, what could that guy possibly have written? So allow me to show you. We have Zapolya, A Christmas Tale. It relates the story of a dying king and his usurping brother, a queen falsely accused of adultery and her banished infant son, and a small group of subjects fiercely loyal to the queen and the rightful prince. Over the course of the play, the usurping tyrant will rebuke the divine right of governance, and he will suffer death for his insolence. The rightful heirs will be returned to the throne. A father and son will be reconciled after disagreements about familial and national duty, and the audience will discover that self-justified tales spun with jealous intentions always end in disaster. And if this sounds familiar, it's because Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale relates almost the same story about 200 years before Coleridge. There's definite character parallels between the plays, very similar moral goals, and the same fragmented structure of time. Both plays contain an onstage gap of almost 2 decades between the first and second part, and that's something revolutionary in their respective theatrical eras. So, Coleridge, rather uncharacteristically, tells you this in his advertisement or his preface to the play. So I won't read this entire thing, but I'll direct your attention to the first sentence, and the form of the following dramatic poem is in the humble imitation of the Winter's Tale of Shakespeare. So that's great, but what does it mean, and why is this important? So during the Romantic period, that is, during Coleridge's time, the Winter's Tale is largely considered to be either A, not worth talking about, or B, seen as having little distinct influence on the production of the period. Coleridge actually gave one recorded lecture of the Winter's Tale, and a Spectator's diary account concluded that he wasted his time. So this sentiment surrounding the play may have kind of contributed to the lack of modern scholarship on the subject. So let's figure out what Coleridge attempted to do in Zapolya to see why scholars should be paying attention to this. So the 18th and early 19th century stage was really enamored with adaptations of The Winter's Tale. From the 1750s to the 1810s, they were extremely popular on the stage in London. So Zapolya sort of bursts onto the scene, and it attempts to take Shakespeare's moral and emotional directives in The Winter's Tale and represent them in a 19th century context. And Coleridge is trying to refute the neoclassical era here. And he called those neoclassical plays things that displayed pretenses to superior morality compared with the plays of Shakespeare. So basically what he means by that is that he thought the preceding era was really devoid of all moral sense, and thus their drama ceased to be effective or worthwhile. His choice of the word imitation as opposed to adaptation in his preface is pretty important because it sets Zapolya apart, but it still cues his audience into well-known themes of loss, reconciliation, and loyalty in The Winter's Tale. So for Coleridge, an imitation takes something that's really familiar to the audience and they builds a new perspective on it through a nuanced representation of the material, and that's going to be important too. So Coleridge has this big aesthetic theory where he claims that drama creates a, quote, effect produced by the congruity of the animal impression with the reflective powers of the mind. So to unpack that, what he's really doing is he's giving his audience agency. They're not a real passive receptor in the theater. They're a group of rational and complex individuals, and they can take these lessons and put them into their own lives. So this is a really big kind of grand conception for the theater, and he designed Zapolya to herald in this era where political, moral, metaphysical, and aesthetical values can all come together and guide the audience to this new knowledge. So to see how this works, we need to explore what Zapolya is specifically refuting in these eras. First, we have the post-Shakespearean acting troupes, the first people that come along after the bard has died. And they come and they start slicing up the scenes of The Winter's Tale, and they add in musical embellishments. And those are really minor changes. They're not doing too much to it. But that starts to balloon into this kind of enterprise of adaptations, and everything just becomes more daring than the last. In the neoclassical era, English audiences shied away from these fantastical stories like The Winter's Tale. They wanted really unobtrusive, sort of classically structured dramas. So to many, the original text of The Winter's Tale seemed formless and unsuitable for the conventions of the neoclassical stage. So what two people, playwrights McNamara Morgan and David Garrick, they responded to this by whittling Shakespeare's text into this presentation of only the fourth act and the reconciliation statue scene. So they're cutting out 4 acts of an entire play. So the 18th century public hungered for this pastoral image. It's an idealized picture of this courtly country life. So they focus on 2 characters in there, Florizel and Perdita. They don't want Leontes and his mad emotional outbursts, and they don't want the bear that chases people off stage. They want this really lighthearted courtship. So what they're doing is they're altering the moral character of the work. And for Coleridge, that's really problematic. It removes the original tragedy of the play and its radical, fragmented structure. So moving forward past that, in the early 19th century, John Philip Kemble revives the original text of The Winter's Tale. He brings this up in order to refamiliarize the audience with the entirety of the story. So he's setting it up for Coleridge to continue forward. So the problem with his stage, though, was that it was too bombastic. The visuals were all over the place, and that was the focus. It was not the morals. So for Coleridge, it's not a successful representation. So now we have to look at where Coleridge succeeds. So Zapolya is set in this place called Illyria. This recalls Napoleon's very real rule over the Illyrian provinces around the Adriatic Sea, but it also recalls the fictional setting of Twelfth Night. So he's taking a really fictional place and something that's real, putting them together to create what's called a dual environment. He's taking particular concrete details and putting the fiction together. Now, the reason that he does this is that he wants to interlace human history with universal truths. And that's how he's going to present these new aesthetic ideals to an audience. So refuting Kemble's tradition here, he abjures the need for a succession of all these exuberant set pieces. He simplifies the setting into this mighty castle and this cave. And they represent, respectively, man's ideological triumphs and his basest instincts. So he wants to make this feel relevant and sort of timeless. He wants to evoke that emotional character of The Winter's Tale without representing the same thing as verbatim, basically. So the problem is the genius behind this composition technique sort of went unnoticed because its dialogue fell flat and its morals were delivered without a lot of nuance. So he contradicts his own theories. So there's some key failures here. One is that you'll notice the play is actually billed as Zapolya or the Werewolf, not Zapolya, A Christmas Tale. And that's because Coleridge really had no hand in staging it. Someone else did. His name was Thomas Dibdin. And he prized this supernatural imagery, sort of analogous to Shakespeare's Bear, over Coleridge's moral vision for the work. So it garnered a lot of commercial success in the short term, but Coleridge wanted this grand representation of the theater as a space for public moral education, and this thing just became a flash in the pan, and no one's really looked at it since. In addition to that, Coleridge's two-part structure, that cave and that castle, could do nothing to really overcome his poor emotional characterization. They present no real parallel to Leontes and Paulina from The Winter's Tale. So the dramatic appeal of Leontes in The Winter's Tale is sort of that he has this real unrelenting and savage coldness towards his own family, but then when he realizes his mistake, there's this really swelling sort of grief that he has. And he's someone who tells his most loyal subject to take his child and put it in the woods and let it die. And then when he figures out everything's been going wrong for him, he commits to go to his wife and son's grave and pray every day. And he says that his tears will be his recreation. So he's got this great promise that he keeps, right? And so in The Winter's Tale, that unrelenting jealousy of Leontes gets tempered by the extreme selflessness of Paulina in defense of her queen. So in short, this assumes a little competency with The Winter's Tale, but the audience knows what a king should be, and Leontes displays these contrary characteristics. As the play develops, Leontes expresses extreme guilt and deference, and Paulina displays this unrelenting and often cruel tongue. So the balance is kept in check. In Zapolya, however, he tries to put two characters through that betrayal-reconciliation cycle, Kruprilli and his son Casimir, but it doesn't really feel organic or impassioned in the text. Casimir rebukes his father, and in the end he does feel bad, but he doesn't bring any punishment down on himself like Leontes, and he displays very little outward physical affectations of his guilt. So this scene right here is the extent of the reconciliation between Kruprilli and Kruprilli and Casimir. Now the problem with this is that when this comes into the play, they haven't seen each other for 20 years. And this is what you get. This is what Coleridge gives you. There is, look, he doth forgive you. Retract thy curse, and then, son, I forgive thee. There's no real, there's not a lot of emotion there. It's just their bond returns way too quickly to be believable. Neither of them show any hostility or apprehensiveness to this. So this is one of the many instances in Zapolya where these emotional expectations are not met. So it leaves the audience feeling lost. But in the end, why does it matter that this play failed? I mean, it's just one thing in his big canon, right? Well, it actually gives some insights into the field, into the scholarship of the field. In short, the majority of the current scholarship on Shakespeare in the Romantic period focuses on Hamlet, King Lear, Macbeth, and Othello. These are major dramas that actually put forth many of the same themes as The Winter's Tale. In addition, the majority of Coleridge scholarship focuses on his connections to Hamlet. So for Coleridge, instances of him sort of overtly addressing The Winter's Tale are few and far between. He did give lectures on Shakespeare, as I've noted before, and the notes that come from that are only 3 pages worth. And he lectured for about 10 years on this theme. So for this reason, Zapolya is this entire dramatic imitation of The Winter's Tale that comes really late in his career, and we have to wonder why. So Coleridge's play sort of suffered from this incomplete character development, and he undercuts his own theories throughout the whole of the text. But it has these metaphysical questions that it raises. And it has a questionable legacy on the trajectory of modern drama. The Winter's Tale was extremely popular on stage during the period that he was writing this, during the period that Romantic scholarship is taking place. But it doesn't really get talked about at all. And Zapolya has this moral and educational purpose that gives it a very unique position in the history of the Romantic stage and in Coleridge's body of work. So what I hope that you get from this is that it deserves this thorough reanalysis of its relevancy and impact during the Romantic era, and more specifically in Coleridge's body of work. So what I hope to do with this is take it into a thesis where I trace these threads of the Winter's Tale through Zapolya into one of Coleridge's most famous poems, Christabel. And I reestablish some of the traditions that scholarship has started.